Support for this episode comes from the inaugural Global Jewish Fertility Support Summit, organized by the nonprofit I Was Supposed to Have a Baby. Taking place on Sunday, May 7th via Zoom, this summit will include some of the most prominent voices from 15 major fertility organizations worldwide. Whether you're on a fertility journey, a professional clergy or lay leader in the space, or if you want to know how to be more sensitive to your friends and family, this summit is for you. Learn more and register for free at iwassupposedtohaveababy.org.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 376, Mitzvah, Reconstructed. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are thrilled to be back for the second episode in our series exploring the Mitzvah. 101 years ago, the first ever, at least in America, bat mitzvah was held at a synagogue called SAJ, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. The first American bat mitzvah girl was named Judith Kaplan, and her father was the rabbi of that synagogue, Mordechai Kaplan, also known as the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. We're excited today to pick up the conversation with Mordechai Kaplan's successor 101 years later, Lauren Grabelle Herrmann, who is the rabbi of SAJ. SAJ partnered with the organization that our guest last week came from, the Jewish Women's Archive, to create a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the bat mitzvah. As part of that celebration, our guest today, Lauren Grabelle Herrmann, put together a number of liturgical works celebrating the 100th anniversary of the bat mitzvah, including blessings to honor bat mitzvah pioneers, female leadership in all areas of community, people having their mitzvahs in adulthood, and a special prayer for transgender and non-binary mitzvah pioneers. We're thrilled to be able to have this conversation with the current rabbi of SAJ to talk both about the history of the very first bat mitzvah and also the reverberations and ramifications of that first bat mitzvah. And we'll talk about how this is a case study for the implications of all kinds of changes and their downstream effects. Before we jump into that conversation, just a reminder that you have about a week to register for our next round of Yeshiva classes. These classes are really exciting opportunities to learn with and from some of our favorite past guests on Judaism Unbound, including a class on philanthropy with Lila Corwin-Berman, a class on the myth of the 12 tribes of Israel with Andrew Tobolowsky, Torah as a State of Statelessness with Lainey Solomon, and an extremely exciting opportunity to study with famed New Yorker cartoonist Liana Fink in a class called Drawing Conclusions, Making Art as Midrash. There is also a class launching at the same time that is actually a 10-month class taught by Miriam Turlinchamp and me, which is an Introduction to Judaism class designed as a class that can work for people interested in converting to Judaism, but also a great introduction to Judaism for people who were born Jewish or converted a long time ago. So if you are excited about any of those classes, just head to judaismunbound.com/classes and you can register for any of them. This next round of classes starts the week of May 7th. And now to introduce our guest, Lauren Grabelle Herrmann. As I mentioned, she is the rabbi of SAJ, Judaism that stands for all. Before coming to SAJ, Lauren Grabelle Herrmann was the founder of Kol Tzedek, the synagogue in West Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, whose current rabbi, Ari Lev Fornari, we interviewed back in episode 279. Lauren Grabelle Herrmann is the co-chair of the Rabbinic Council for JFREJ, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and she is also an active clergy member of New Sanctuary Coalition, an organization that fights for immigrants at risk for detention and deportation in New York City. Lauren Grabelle Herrmann has rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. We are so excited to jump into this conversation about the 100th anniversary, now the 101st anniversary of the very first American bat mitzvah from the ground on which it took place. So Lauren Grabelle Herrmann, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be with you.
As I was reflecting about Judy Kaplan and her first bat mitzvah, I was thinking, did anybody imagine that 101 years later, that the synagogue that Judy Kaplan had her first bat mitzvah in would be led by a woman rabbi? And I was wondering if you could just sort of reflect a little bit on how you think about sitting in that chair.
In terms of your question about would anyone have imagined that, I think yes. Rabbi Kaplan introduced bat mitzvah 2 weeks after getting to SAJ. So this is a congregation that was on the edge of increasing and involving the participation of people who are not typically involved in synagogue life from the beginning. I think that's a really important thing to say, that this wasn't just incidental that it happened at SAJ. It wasn't 2 or 3 years down the road. It was 2 weeks. He introduced the idea to the board of directors 2 weeks into a brand new synagogue. Can you imagine?
Did he do any interesting things in those first 2 weeks?
I don't actually know, but I know they had their first service. I know he started writing in his journal about things, but it was more just, he was running away from another synagogue, from the Jewish center right down the block. And, the Jewish center was going in more of a traditional Orthodox direction, and Kaplan was doing his rabble-rousing thing, and it wasn't a good fit.
Rabble-rousing spelled R-A-B-B-I.
There you go. Exactly. Rabbi Rousing. He spoke out about conditions of factory workers to a congregation of predominantly factory owners. That was number one. So he immediately got a lot of attention for calling out the people in his pews for not being ethical. And then on top of that, just in terms of ritual and the fact that bat mitzvah was clearly on his mind, and they just weren't ready to go there. So when he came to SAJ, it was top of mind. It was something, it wasn't just, let's try this. It was, I have daughters, they need bat mitzvah. This is something I believe in. Let's get this done. This congregation is perfect for female leadership. And currently we have also a female cantor. So it's all women leadership. In terms of my own background, we were like cultural, ethnic, kind of Jewish identity. That was what I was kind of being taught at home. But we did occasional stuff and we did some holidays. Somehow, even though my family was not interested in Judaism, somehow, even though my synagogue was not egalitarian and I did not have a bat mitzvah that was equal to the male friends of mine, I somehow managed to find my way into wanting to be part of this Jewish thing and then continuing my Jewish journey from there. I remember the day when I found out that my synagogue was not fully egalitarian. Like, I think I was a kid. I didn't really even fully understand it. And it was actually the day of my bat mitzvah. So I knew there were men on the bima. I knew the women weren't on the bima. Like, I didn't like it, but it was all I knew. And I got to my bat mitzvah and I was on a Friday night and I stood up in front of the congregation. I was very theatrical and dramatic. So I was very excited to be in front of everyone. It was not a problem. I was happy to have the spotlight. And I sang 2 songs and I did a Haftorah. And then I got off I left the bima, and at the Oneg Shabbat.
Oneg Shabbat being the little gathering with eating some food afterwards, celebrating schmoozing.
One of my friend's parents said to me, wow, you did such a great job. It seems like the girls are doing almost as much as the boys nowadays. And I thought, what? Like, what just happened? And because I wasn't knowledgeable and I wasn't really, we weren't active as Jews. We weren't thinking about these things. I then realized, oh my God, I got the second class version of this. And then I went to other bar mitzvahs and I saw what they were doing. I was like, I left that synagogue swiftly after my bat mitzvah. But I didn't leave Judaism behind, but I knew I did not want anything to do with Judaism that wasn't fully affirming of myself as a young Jewish woman.
That's really powerful to hear and heartbreaking to hear, because we're not talking to somebody who is 100 years old, like the bat mitzvah is, or I guess 101 now. We're talking to somebody who is much younger than that. So we've made some progress, but maybe less than we would like. I want to hone in on something you said. You mentioned that it was a second-class experience for girls who experience bar mitzvah. So for me, there's like the aspirational, what we would like bar mitzvah to be, that's like the first class. Then there's the second class, which is what many dudes get to experience.
Yeah.
And then there's the third class, which continues to be imposed on girls becoming women, and often non-binary folks as well. So I want to bring that because we're at the beginning of this unit and it's something we should be thinking about the whole way through. But I think there's a gap in how we conceptualize what bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah are. And it's that we think it's a process where people become official participants in Jewish life. Participants being the operating word. Like, they learn various prayers and some story from the Torah or prophets. You mentioned Haftorah, books of the prophets. But like, it's mostly about being initiated into the group as a participant, as a member. In my dream world, it would actually be about being initiated as a creator, as a doer, as a maker of what Judaism is. And the reason I'm bringing that up with you specifically is that one of your roles with Bat Mitzvah at 100 is that you actually crafted prayers where you consciously create opportunities to celebrate those who have pioneered Bat Mitzvah and those who have pioneered gender-neutral B Mitzvah and a few other offerings. And so I wanted to hear from you about why it's important to you to craft new Jewish liturgy today. A lot of people don't do it. We do the prayers that are out there, and if we don't have one, we look for one somewhere that somebody else wrote. What called you to actually write prayers for this purpose yourself, and how might that maybe be a model for others out there listening who could craft their own liturgy as well?
One of the things that I truly love about Judaism is the capacity for creativity. And for me as a Reconstructionist, especially, to see the unfolding of time and the constant reconstruction of Jewish tradition. Like, that's the fundamental concept of what does it mean to be a Reconstructionist for me. So it's not just about being a passive participant in Jewish life. It's about saying we get to actively decide how we want to reconstruct this tradition for the next generation. Liturgy creation, ritual creation is a significantly important part of that for rabbis, but for all Jews. And I think it should be for everyone. And I just want to make sure that your listeners know, and they probably, hopefully many of them do, but there's an incredible website that's called Ritual Well. It's existed for decades. People submit their rituals, their prayers, their reflections, and they think about what are the milestones in life, in Jewish life, but in life, that are not recorded and don't have rituals for them because our ancestors, as wise as they were, couldn't have anticipated those things happening or couldn't have centered those experiences because they were not having those experiences. So in particular, I'm thinking about, all the rituals around women and women's lives, right? So you have, rituals for getting your first period, rituals for what about a miscarriage, right? Is there anything a prayer that someone could say that is a painful moment? And one of the beautiful things about liturgy is you don't have to think with liturgy. You just get the text, and that text centers you and holds you in such an incredible way. That's what's so powerful about the mourner's Kaddish. The words in many ways did not matter. It's the fact that in a moment of grief, you don't have to think. You have the words, and they speak for you, and they hold you, and they allow you to have that space. We're just missing so many milestones. This is, I think, something that Jewish feminism has really enabled a transformation in Jewish life, to recognize the need for these daily moments that are not necessarily covered by our tradition. So in general, I think that this is a really important way to be a co-creator of Judaism. I wouldn't even say a creator, I'd say a co-creator, because we're doing it alongside of other people and in community. So when it came to having this Bat Mitzvah at 100, which was in 2022, we knew we needed all kinds of resources, including adult education resources, including, videos, all these amazing pieces. But we also knew that liturgy was really important because it grounds, it transforms, it gives something, not just a secular feeling of celebration, but a holiness, right? I don't know the number, but many, I would say at least 100, I would think, or more, congregations used some version of this liturgy. If they weren't having maybe a huge program for the 100th anniversary of the Bat Mitzvah, but then at least they had this ritual moment where they could call up some group of people to honor the pioneers or their adult B'nai Mitzvah class or the current class of B'nai Mitzvah students or, whatever version of that.
So first off, I'm thrilled to hear that 100 congregations or more used this liturgy, channeled this liturgy. I'm always, the word use with prayer is a struggle for me, but like channeled it for some purpose or used it, whatever works. We need this. And I think Ritual Well, I'm so glad you shouted it out. I mean, there are a lot of resources that have started on Ritual Well, and then we don't always chronicle the process, but a decade later, they're being used everywhere, and nobody quite knows where they started. It's just like, it's almost like those song melodies that are attributed to Anonymous. And I wanted to hear from you, like, you didn't just make any prayers. You chose a few particular avenues, not that others couldn't add to those avenues, but talk to us about some of the particular blessings that you wrote. And because you start them in a traditional way, you mention matriarchs, and in one situation you mention, I'm going to say matriarchs, multiply gendered ancestors. Talk to us about that process of creating these blessings and why you chose the ones that you did.
When I was creating the liturgy for Bat Mitzvah at 100, Rise Up Shabbat.
Quick note to all of you out there listening, it may actually be helpful the next few minutes to be looking at the blessings that we're talking about. So you can head to our show notes and click the link in show note number 2, or head to JWA's Bat Mitzvah at 100 section and click Ritual and Liturgy.
I really wanted, first and foremost, to honor the pioneers. In every synagogue across America, there has, over the last 100 years, there has been a first. And that person, much like Judith Kaplan, had to be courageous. And in many cases, those people had to fight. We have stories, people who, Bat Mitzvah wasn't handed to them. It wasn't just like, oh, this is a great idea, and then they went from there. They actually needed to write a letter to the ritual committee, right? The ritual committee had to make a decision. The rabbi had to get involved. The rabbi had to decide whether they're going to take a controversial stand. People banged down the doors so that this could happen. So I wanted to honor the fact that those folks had to have chutzpah and bravery and courage and had to really work hard. And that was the first and foremost of where I started. So in that prayer, along with the traditional words, I said, we honor and celebrate your commitment, your chutzpah, your willingness, like Judith Kaplan, to step forward as a bat mitzvah where there were no others in front of you to lead the way. And to really acknowledge how scary that is to be first. And that those folks are still around. Most people, it's not 100 years, right? It's in the last 40, 50 years. Those folks are still in our congregations. In fact, in my synagogue, we had an aliyah for anyone who was a first. And there was at least 4 or 5 women in my congregation who were the first in their synagogues. The second was that what happened with Bat Mitzvah was that it wasn't just about the ritual leadership. It wasn't just ritual. Bat Mitzvah opened the door for all kinds of participation in Jewish life. Like, wow, if they can do it, we can do all these other things. Women hadn't been chairs of their board, right? Presidents of their synagogues. They hadn't been ritual committee chairs. They had, none of that stuff was really available, for sure, not 100 years ago, but even for some a few decades ago. And Bat Mitzvah is not like what we wanted to celebrate at Bat Mitzvah at 100 was not just that one act by Judith Kaplan, but everything that came after it and how important that moment, a barrier breaking moment, is to changing everything. In that one, I wrote, we honor your leadership, we vision and commitment, and bless them that they continue to see their fruits of labor blossoming in their communities. And I compare them to Miriam, the prophetess who takes out her timbrel and who decides to lead all the women in the community and really all of the people in the community at the end of walking through the Song of the Sea. That sense of prophetessness, I don't know the word for it, but that would enable more people and enable our communities to change, because we know that our communities change when the leaders of those communities change. Just like today, empowering Jews of color, empowering trans and non-binary Jews, like those voices matter. They need to come from margin to center so that they can truly transform our communities.
And so in addition to those, you have a blessing that disrupts our age norms of Bar Mitzvah. You have a blessing for adult Bar Mitzvah. And then you also have a blessing that honors those who are in the process right now of a newer process, pioneering Bar Mitzvah, pioneering ritual for non-binary folks, and often being that kind of first. So take us into those 2 blessings.
I think any rabbi that has worked with adult B'nai Mitzvah will tell you it's among their favorite things to do. What's better than people wanting to deepen their relationship with Judaism and come to terms with it on their own as adults? And I had the opportunity that year of the Bat Mitzvah anniversary to have a class of 17 adult B'nai Mitzvah, 2 men and 15 women. They were women between the ages of 23 and 85, I believe. So it was a hugely intergenerational mix. And it's just such a powerful thing because this is really, I think in some ways what B'nai Mitzvah is about, saying, I want in, truly a choice, and saying, like, I want to be part of this. So for us, that was just really important to acknowledge adult B'nai Mitzvah. And honestly, Judith Kaplan also had an adult B'nai Mitzvah at the age of 82, which was really meaningful. So in that one, I talked about giving thanks for Judith Kaplan and all the pioneers who established Bat Mitzvah for the generations to come. We honor those who came before us and help us claim our rightful place in the Jewish tradition and community. And of course, one of the things that was central to our mission as part of Bat Mitzvah at 100 was not making this just about women, but making this about breaking barriers. What does it mean to take a tradition that's lasted thousands of years in Judaism, although, it really, most of these hundreds, it developed in a modern way, in the Middle Ages, but, hundreds of years, and then say, boom, we're going to transform it because we wanted to have more access for everyone. It was really important to all of us who are organizing this effort to not have this be only a women's story, but be about what does it mean to break barriers. And for us, it's the moment right now is around trans and non-binary youth, about making space for people so they don't look back on their B'nai Mitzvah experience with regret, with sadness, with feeling like it wasn't truly their authentic self. I mean, it's such a painful thing. Like, we wanted to contribute to congregations having hard conversations that they weren't necessarily having already, and to say all these kids that are coming up and exploring their identity, recognizing that people might not know yet exactly who they are and are going to be. So it was really, really important that we advance the conversations around Bar Mitzvah in the congregations that weren't either yet having them or were just needed to be moved along a little bit more. So when I wrote this, I wrote, when Judith Kaplan rose as the first Bat Mitzvah in 1922, she not only initiated Bat Mitzvah, she opened the door for people of all genders to rise and claim their rightful place within the Jewish community, and for the courage and vision of those transgender and non-binary Jews who, like Judith Kaplan, stepped forward when there were no others in front of you to lead the way. Acknowledging all those people who took that courageous step and are taking those courageous steps right now. And in this blessing is a little different, this final blessing, than the others. The others assume people are comfortable and we're celebrating them. This blessing acknowledges that there is still more work to do. And honestly, right now in 2023, the assault on transgender human life right this moment, and non-binary people of all ages, but especially youth, this blessing sort of acknowledges that not every Jewish community is safe yet, and that we will commit to building a world of love. Olam Chesed Yibaneh, we will build a world of love, that all transgender and non-binary pioneers, and I would say even just anyone, be kept from safety and harm. That is a blessing that is still, unfortunately, very much needed.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier, at least how I understood it, which is that you said, I think, that much of ritual innovation is coming from women. And I'm curious whether you think that that's the case because, like you alluded to, well, in a world in which for so much of Jewish history there weren't ceremonies, then once you admit half the population into the centers of creativity, then of course the first thing they're going to do is make a lot of new rituals for them. So that makes sense that a lot of the innovations that we would be seeing would start as women innovating for women, for themselves. But I'm wondering whether you were speaking even more broadly than that. A lot of innovation now is happening by queer and trans folk, et cetera. But I wonder, I'm trying to think of this from the perspective of your more conservative person, not necessarily politically conservative, but kind of Jewishly conservative, who says, I do think that it should be more open, but if we're going to open the doors and then all these people are going to come in, they're going to change Judaism. They're kind of right. And I guess my question is, how do we think about them? How do you think about them as a pastoral provider that says there are people in this community who, in their mind, Judaism is supposed to kind of be the way it always has been, and that gives them comfort. And like you were talking about, the role of ritual as being these familiar words and not having to think. And how do we kind of balance those two objectives?
That's a great question. I want to first start by saying I don't know because I'm not calculating exactly the emissions on Ritual Well, and I'm sure there are many men that are writing rituals, and so I want to say that clearly. And they're obviously, that's wonderful. I do think that Jewish feminism as a wave in Judaism impacted this notion that we can create rituals for things that are not presently available to us. Like not having mikvah only be about menstrual cycle and before you're getting married, right? But having that become another ritual that can hold us through so many different life cycles, right? So many different moments in our lives. So I do think whether or not whoever the producers are, I think it is something that we have to thank our Jewish feminist ancestors for and be grateful for them, for their bringing us to this day. There is so much power for people creating ritual for themselves. I have a transgender 15-year-old son, and he's coming for an aliyah. And that aliyah, just to acknowledge his legal name change and to take on a new Hebrew name. And my husband my husband works for Keshet, so LGBTQ Jews, and we're trying to find a name for the ceremony. And there's no name. We had consulted the Trans Halacha Project because there's not this is also new, and I think it's a beautiful outgrowth of Judaism being responsive to the world in which we live, but also there's something so powerful about people creating rituals for their community. That is what makes Judaism rich, is the contributions of the people in it. That's my take on it. But I do want to also say something before I address the pastoral concerns of those who are a little bit afraid. I want to make sure everyone understands that there's a long history of Judaism and Jewish ritual being spontaneous and actually speaking to the moments of the need. Before we had a printing press, our Siddur was, cover these themes in your Amidah, right? But the person who was leading that service could be like, okay, let's, go this direction. Another person could be like, let's go this direction. You had to cover the final Khatima, the final closing blessing. But as long as you got the theme, you could riff. That kind of got taken away from us when we went into prayer books and Siddurim and, all these things that were, just kind of in some ways positive routinizing of what we did. But on the other hand, stifling some of that creativity. And now with the internet and the capacity to create being something that is as easy as creating a new Google Doc, I think it's actually recapturing some of the old. In terms of people being afraid, I think in the synagogue, in everyday Jewish life, there have to be things that hold us, right? If our service is completely different every week, then people aren't going to feel that sense of comfort and stability that comes with joining a synagogue. And at the same time, bringing in Bat Mitzvah 100 special prayers, or bringing in a prayer for Transgender Day of Remembrance or Transgender Day of Visibility or Black Lives Matter, it only enhances. And I think you can hold both.
So I've been known to criticize Rabbinic Judaism a lot. And I'm going to take a moment and say that there's something really powerful that rabbis decided to do, which is way back when they decided that if something looks like a typo in sacred Jewish text, it can't be a typo. They're going to find some hidden reason why it's a typo, and they're going to find an interpretation. I think there's problems to that, but I also think it's expansive and beautiful and allows for us to build our own thoughts and interpretations in. You had a little oral typo that I'm going to remind myself to not edit out by asking this question, but you had a little oral typo where you said break barriers, where you said bake first and then break. And I want to sit with that for a second. And I promise this is going to take one or two steps, but part of what is powerful about Bat Mitzvah and what's powerful about feminism or Jewish feminism is what you described with Jewish women, Jewish girls, Jewish non-binary folks being able to do things that Jewish men or cisgender Jews have been able to do already. So having a Bat Mitzvah alongside Bar Mitzvah and alongside B Mitzvah is a huge deal. There's another side of it, and that's what I'm thinking of as the bake barriers. We need to both empower non-men to do the stuff that men have done historically, and we need to look around and say, women have been there. trans non-binary folks have been there. What were they already doing? I promise you, walk to your nearest synagogue and look at their wall and see who's on it. They will have synagogue presidents, mostly men for a long time, and maybe in the last few decades, some women. You know who they won't have? The people who cooked the meals 100 years ago or 60 years ago. I bet you that in the vast majority of, I mean, I could say American Jewish communities, but every Jewish communities, most global communities of any kind, the people doing that were women. And yes, there are absolutely some ancient and some more recent ways of celebrating what happens in a domestic sphere. There's a lot less. And again, those people don't get on the wall in the synagogue. Those people don't get in the center of the history books most of the time, although I'm grateful to all the scholars that are out there feminizing different spheres of the humanities. So I guess what I'm curious about is, how do we bring that spirit to this as well? How do we make this not just about, it's like increasing the numerator and decreasing the denominator, if that makes sense. Like there's giving rights that were not there before, and there's what were they doing already? How do we better celebrate and recognize that labor alongside the things like rabbiing and prayer leadership and whatever that men mostly did, and having that be open to other genders as well?
I really love what you're saying here. And I think it's an overlooked part of this conversation. It's not just about equality, right? It's about acknowledging and seeing what's been there all along, and also making sure where we put our value is not only on these things that get public reward, but also, so I think it's a really important point. I like to tell, or so just sort of this understanding of this interpretation of Miriam. So, and in the desert and all the women, how they, had such a short time to pack. They have to bring all they can carry. They have no idea how long they're going to be on this journey. And it's probably heavy, right? Whatever they have to pack. So they have to pack enough rations for a few days. They're probably more responsible for the children. So they're packing, diapers, they're packing whatever they're packing. It's not just for them, but for other people. And lo and behold, we come to the, time of this parting of the sea. And what do they have in their packs? They also have drums, timbrels. So the fact that these women were not just responsible for caretaking, right? They were responsible for community life. They were responsible for the joy. They were responsible for bringing, and it's a radical idea to pack a timbrel or a drum when you have a small little pack you have to bring and schlep around children too. So what does that mean to say, like, here's all the women, they're making this decision? That is something I think also to be praised, right? It's not just Moses leading the people out. It's the foresight of these women who have to take care of everything, and who are also taking care of the community. It's really important that we see who has been in our community all along, and we learn to switch, how we honor people. One of the things that we've been doing a small way in our synagogue is just to have volunteer, recognitions to Shabbat, and acknowledge all the different people, and to acknowledge not just the people who are like heading the committees, but the people who pour the Kiddush cups. Who are the folks that are sustaining our community in so many small ways that we couldn't be there without them, but they rarely get the kind of acknowledgement that they need.
So as you're talking about all this, I feel like we haven't done a deep dive into what Reconstructionism is really all about. And I think it would actually be interesting for our listeners to explore that a little bit as a movement that's actually built around these ideas, because there are ways in which I'm also looking at the liturgy that you wrote, for example, for the bat mitzvah. And there's kind of like, it starts in a way that sounds kind of traditional, like, may the one who blessed our ancestors, so and so. But then it kind of drifts away from the one who blessed into the blessing of the people themselves, by us or by some unclear by whom. And I'm just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about how you see the approach to Judaism from the perspective of Reconstructionism as a movement, but also as a rabbi. Like, what does it mean to be a Reconstructionist rabbi as opposed to a Reform or conservative rabbi in terms of how one approaches some of the kinds of questions that we're talking about?
Mordecai Kaplan, and I get to sit in this really auspicious chair, right? Because again, whether or not you're Reconstructionist, Mordecai Kaplan's ideas influenced and changed the Jewish community writ large. He believed, and he was the first to articulate, that Judaism was an evolving religious civilization. It was a people, a culture, a tradition. And the key word, I think, for this conversation is evolving. It's not something static. It's something that's always changed. And I think many of us, because his ideas have infiltrated and really been part of American Judaism today, will say, oh, yeah, okay, we understand that. That makes sense. But really, if you think about what does that mean to say evolving, it means a lot of the decisions, we go back and we think, oh, those just evolved, Judaism evolved this way. It's actually purposeful. Our ancestors made choices to steer our Judaism in particular paths. We see this in Passover. There are 5 promises in the book of Exodus of that, and the 4 cups of wine are modeled on the first 4, just taking off the last one, which is about going to the land, because that wasn't the experience of the rabbis at the time. And they didn't want people to get too excited about something that wasn't possible in that moment, right? We understand as Reconstructionists that these decisions didn't just happen. They didn't just, something, they went to a different place and then it's not passive. Ancestors have made decisions throughout history that have enabled us to be here today, and that is our responsibility. We can't be passive. We get to make decisions too. And those decisions are going to impact the next generation. And right now, especially right now, you guys always, talk about, we're in this moment, right? We're in this crisis opportunity moment of the Jewish people. So what are the decisions we want to make so that we leave the kind of legacy that we want? Now, that's not to say we don't have the weight of tradition. We hold the weight of tradition, but we're gently steering it. And I think that's the key for me for this conversation of what I bring with a Reconstructionist lens, is that sense of active and empowered decision-making. What are the through lines? What do we want to keep? How do we want to keep evolving?
Okay, so I want to ask you a question that a lot of people ask me a lot when I talk this way. Are there any limitations to that? And also, I just also want to point out, you talked about gently leading, but if we're talking about that first bat mitzvah, I'm not sure how gentle it was, right? That sometimes it's not so gentle. So a lot of times when I talk this way, people say, but what are the limitations? And I tend to say there are none, that the limitations will be defined by the future, by whether these ideas grab hold of people, whether people ultimately are able to rewrite our stories so that this new thing that we did becomes a natural evolution from something that we did in the past, even though that wasn't actually how it came about. But I'm curious whether you think about it the same way, whether you talk about it the same way, or whether you have a different way of responding to a question like that.
I really love your response. And I actually think it plays itself out in the understanding of Mordecai Kaplan. Kaplan did things that clicked and did things that didn't click. Kaplan said, no chosen people. And generally speaking, the Jewish people rejected that. Reconstructionism accepted that. And that's still kind of the way it is, right? On the other hand, Kaplan said Jewish peoplehood is primary, and that was accepted, right? And then on a very small level, but very shows the point, right? It will be told by the people and by the future. Kaplan hated Kol Nidre, the prayer of right before the beginning of Yom Kippur services, a very strange prayer. It gets you out of future mistakes. And he decided to take it out. And the whole congregation was up in arms. It has been what they've heard their entire lives. And how can you can't have Yom Kippur without Kol Nidre? And he put it back in and he changed a little bit. So it was a little bit more past tense versus future tense, but the people rejected it. You got to try things and you'll know and you'll see. So I really appreciate your answer. And I think it plays out in this scenario. I think another thing that the Reconstructionist movement, especially today, does extremely well is to really center voices on the margin. That is something that I think we do very well. And there's a ton of effort right now going into empowering Jews of color, investing in Jews of color and trans and non-binary folks. And I think that what that kind of comes from this, kind of inclination of Kaplan. Kaplan wasn't, it was 100 years ago, a different context, but there's no reason not to include these voices. And right, the Jewish people is going to be made up of who is in the Jewish people. So we need to make sure all voices are heard.
We have hinted at it here and there, but honestly, our podcast is deeply influenced by Reconstructionist thought, both directly in that I think both Dan and I are familiar with Kaplan's writings and Reconstructionist communities, and indirectly through the ways that a lot of how Kaplan has had his impact is actually not just through Reconstructionist institutions. It's through him doing things that then slowly rippled
Yeah.
and affected huge populations and arguably the entirety. I think even Orthodox Judaism has changed as a result of Mordechai Kaplan. So this is a good moment for us to thank one of our own intellectual forebears. I do want to dwell a little back in Bat and B Mitzvah, though, because I am flashing back to the early part of this conversation where we talked about this isn't yet what we want it to be. I'm curious to think with you and with all of our guests in this unit about what the better version of B Mitzvah would be, because I think even in contexts that are recognizing B Mitzvah across different gender distinctions, there's a lot of work to do. I really do think that a huge component of it is that we have to find a way for B Mitzvah to not just be about, it's like a quiz or a test at the end of a semester where you're supposed to have mastered a certain set of things. Now, different congregations have a different set of things. For some of them, they care more about knowing certain prayers. For others, they emphasize that you know about certain Jewish values. The closest thing we have is that it is a norm in many contexts for people at age 12 and 13 at B Mitzvah or adult B Mitzvah to say their thought about a Torah portion, to give a Devar Torah. And that's great, but it's still a commentary. It's still, I am going to say my thing about a previously existing Jewish thing. I'm curious if we could push ourselves in our communities to have a chiddush requirement. Chiddush is a Hebrew word meaning new thing. And I actually think it's used really problematically. It's used as if it's this really rare thing. When a rabbi comes up with a chiddush in Jewish law or in it's this huge deal because most of the time we don't make new framework. We're working within the old. I think chiddushes happen all the time. I think when the 5 and 6-year-olds are asked to do an art project related to a Jewish thing, you find, if there's 15 students in the class, 15 beautiful Jewish chiddushes. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's uncommon. I think we dismiss those things and we treat them as not quite real because they aren't thousands of years old with a hectare of Jewish history. And so I'm curious, should we be pushing B Mitzvah to have a practice run of creating a new form of Jewish ritual or action or storytelling or fill in the blank? Or maybe am I pushing it too far and you could do that at other moments of life?
I'm feeling a little torn, honestly, here. It's not that I don't agree that we should think more about B Mitzvah. We need to think how to make it as meaningful as possible. And I think there's a lot going on. There's power in doing things that have been done and stepping into your place. There's power in realizing that you have a voice, and the Torah commentary is that. This is, no one has ever said what you've said before. This is your unique contribution to the Jewish people. You are advancing Judaism by whatever you say. And I think for the kids that clicks with, and some of them in my congregation lead a discussion. They'll bring up something and they'll come up with an idea and they'll lead a discussion if they feel brave. And then that's incredibly empowering to have the congregants who are at any age of 25 to 100 basically responding to their intellectual ideas. And I also see these kids are at a particular time in their lives and they're young. For the kids for whom they can go that extra mile, we should do more. And for some, just standing up there and saying 5 words is frightening. And the fact that they're doing it makes them feel incredibly amazing. So I guess what I'm going to say is I think yes. And, I think we should be empowering. We should be thinking about how they can be more creative and adding to the Jewish people. And, I think that what we want to do in this moment is open them up to understanding that that's what it means to be Jewish. As they have more years and maturity and interest, that's when they can be creating something brand new. The main thing is that somehow we have to make B Mitzvah about that individual child, even if they're doing similar or same things as their peers. So somehow getting to know and empowering that kid so that the service as much as possible or the experience reflects who they are and their values. That can also be done through mitzvah projects. And at SAJ, we do a Chavaya project. So they're looking at independence, responsibility, and learning as 3 core components. And they are invited to do different pieces of that, right? So however we can make this experience about that individual person and meeting them where they are. But then I think the main message we need to send to these kids is that exactly what we've been talking about today. This is not about a passive relationship. we want you to know that your voice matters and your voice is going to make a difference in how the next generation experiences Judaism.
I think I have two different questions, but I'm going to ask them together, partly because we're running out of time and partly because I think that they're connected. I have an instinct that they're connected. One question has to do with essentially the adult bar mitzvah. In some of the answer that you just gave, you're talking about, look, these are basically young kids and there's limits to what young kids want to do, etc. And I'm wondering, though, whether that might signal that we need a Jewish ceremony at a different age or maybe multiple different ages, because, there's this mindset that, okay, the bar mitzvah takes place when you're 12 or 13, and if we can't really get what we want to accomplish, then, well, too bad. We'll do the best we can, and that'll be the end of it. But it feels to me, especially as my kids are going off to college, it feels to me like there are obvious times of life when it would make sense to have some kind of Jewish coming-of-age ceremony. It wouldn't necessarily have to be in the synagogue. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a huge affair with an enormous party, but it would be something meaningful at certain times of life, and we don't have those at all in Judaism. How can we be inspired by the creation, in this case, of the first bat mitzvah, to say, what should we be creating? What should we be thinking about that is absent from the Jewish landscape? But it's not absent, actually, in our minds. Stephen Covey talks about how everything is created twice. The first time it's created is in our thoughts, and the second time it's created is practically on the ground. So I want to think a little bit about what should be created in our minds before we talk about what should be created on the ground. And I think that my connected question to that is whether you could do a little bit of forecasting, futurology, which is to say, can we imagine something that will happen over the next 5 years or so as some kind of new Jewish experience or ritual that in 100 years from now, you would have to be doing a podcast series about it to explain to people that it was actually an innovation, because it seems so obvious that that thing must have existed forever, because why wouldn't it have? And that's what I think a lot of people think about the bat mitzvah.
When I had this recent class of adult b'nai mitzvah, I called it a B or re mitzvah class, so that those people who had a bar mitzvah or bar or bat mitzvah at the time when they were younger, and it was not meaningful, they didn't remember anything from it, they didn't get anything from it, or maybe it was, but it was just so long ago, they could do it again. So several people in the cohort were re mitzvah and not just bar mitzvah for the first time. And I think that's a really powerful model to say, look, you were really young. I think the hardest, in some ways, part of this whole process of b'nai mitzvah and synagogue life, and it's a critique that we need to deal with, is that then in some ways, for most people, their Jewish education ends at 13, right when their mind is becoming ready to be sharp. It's such a travesty of the Jewish, people come to me, in their 20s and 30s, are getting married, and they haven't done anything since they're, bar mitzvah, right? And it's like time stood still, and their experience of Judaism is what it was when they were 11, 12, and 13. I mean, that is something we have to reckon with as a people. So this was my small attempt to say, hey, you can make this still meaningful, and it doesn't have to be that you've never had before. So I think that's something we could invite people to consider, but we do have to solve this bigger problem of how Judaism becomes frozen at 13 for so many people at a time when it's Judaism, the religion of critical thinking, constantly evaluating, one-upping each other's answers on things. That's exactly perfect, right? For like adolescence and for young adulthood. And so we need to figure out better ways, to engage post b'nai mitzvah, and that's sort of the negative. I believe that it was the Reform movement back in a long time ago, but in the beginning of the Reform movement, that wanted to move bar mitzvah to 16, right?
Well, they went to confirmation. They did
Right,
effectively
they
move
did.
it. They eliminated. I mean, they didn't eliminate
Yes.
it, but most communities didn't do bar mitzvah.
Yes.
They did confirmation around 16 instead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I remember reading something about this, that there was actually a talk of like car mitzvah, like when you're getting your driver's license, that's when your bar mitzvah should be, right? So sure, I'd love to have bar mitzvah be at 16. It makes a lot more sense. But it seems like the Jewish people are voting with their feet, that 13, it's something very powerful about that continues. In terms of other Jewish coming of age rituals, I think that graduation, voting, turning 18, that is a critical moment where at the very least, the Jewish community should be bringing back kids together to celebrate that moment, ritualize that moment and create something. And that could be at a synagogue, that could be at a separate event, however you do it and whatever community you're in. But that feels to me like it's a moment for everyone also, right? It's a moment for parents. Like just the way that, a parent is emotional because their kid is moving towards responsibility. We'll talk about, moving towards responsibility. You're going to college or you're doing gap year or you're not, you're going to trade school, whatever you're doing, but you're leaving home in some way. That moment is a critical time that I would like to see something more than just individual communities or individual families, but something broader.
I would push a little bit on what I'm hearing from both of you. And maybe it's that I'm sensitive to those moments where I was too young for various things. I do think that pretty much all 12 and 13-year-olds are ready to bring some kind of new something to Judaism. Now, how we define that needs to be expansive. And like you said, absolutely, Lauren, the only way that works is if you're working on a case by case and really meeting each student with their passions. Students at age 12 and 13, they have passions, they have hobbies, they have things they love. They may have an easier time finding a chiddush related to playing volleyball that they really love doing and tying that to Judaism than here's a list of Jewish things, find a chiddush. Like, I think it's mostly working backwards. It's finding what is that passion and how do you tie it to Jewish in some way or another. That's not how Jewish educators are used to working. We have our curriculum, we have our content areas, we have our things, and within those things, we want to find the stuff that works for each student. But I think if a student is really into K-pop, that can be a chiddush. And the other piece of evidence I always give for that, Bezalel, the character in the Torah who was empowered to be one of two primary leaders to build the tabernacle, the wandering center where God kind of lived in the wandering in the wilderness. The Talmud says he was 13 years old when he was empowered to do that. So I think that if he was able to do that, today we can find stuff. But what I agree with you on strongly, even as I say all that, is people are capable of all sorts of stuff when they're 12 and 13, and we still need adult rituals. At the beginning of this podcast, some of our earliest episodes, Dan, you might have forgotten about this. I talked about my bar 26th.
I remember it well.
You can determine. I had recently turned 26, and I was like, that's double 13. I want to do a thing. And it was not a ceremony. Like, Dan, you mentioned how it might not be that we have an event. It wasn't like that. I set up some goals for myself over an entire year, and it was really meaningful for me. And it was a little bit meaningful for my wife, who I wouldn't stop talking to about all of it and who helped me a lot, because for me, the big thing was building a sukkah. Some people are anxious about public speaking. I've never struggled with that. My thing is I'm terrible at building things. I hate it. It scares the shit out of me. I'm insecure about it. People say stuff is easy. I get overwhelmed. I can't do any of it. I get frustrated. So we got a really basic sukkah kit. And together, because even in this, I needed help from my wife, who was way better at that than me, we built a sukkah. And that, for me, I was already in rabbinical school. I was at a place of deep Jewish learning, but that was something I had never done. Build a sukkah with one other person, not as part of a group of 20 that we're all building a sukkah. That should be the thing. There should be this notion of every once in a while, we're checking in. What haven't we done Jewishly? What have we? So I'm curious as we close, if there's maybe a both and here.
First of all, I love that story. And I love that you did this, building the sukkah as your goal. And it was very specific. I think there are ways that this is happening on the ground in some ways with young people. At our synagogue, we try to figure out what people's passions are and then connect that to the projects that they're working on. So it's not the ritual moment, but it's, one kid is really into soccer. So how can they bring this passion for soccer to social justice, right? And so right now, this kid is organizing a game of soccer, or trying to organize a game with the new immigrants that have come to New York City, incorporating that as part of the Mitzvah project. So, but I think I will take your push in that we can also do this ritually, and not just in those moments of projects, but in some ways we have to be able to get to know the kids, see their passions, and help them, mentor them through this process. So it's not just rote, learning. I think it's a really important thing. The checking in is important. I started a group at my synagogue where we meet once a month on Saturdays. It's a spiritual practices group. And every month we have a spiritual practice that we look at, and everyone does on their own with different kinds of options. So one could be, right now it's counting Yomer. Beforehand, we were looking at sacred eating. So whatever that was for you, that could be starting to say brachot. That could be just thinking about what goes in your mouth, a meditation moment, a birkat hamazon, whatever it was. So I think that this idea that what are you doing? What do you need help in? How can Judaism serve you in wherever you are in that moment? This is here to serve you and make you a better person is so vital.
So as we close this episode, we've touched a little bit on Bar Mitzvah and the ways in which this ritual is becoming more expansive along gender lines. Can you take us into what it looks like to mold as a congregation some norms so that it's not unexpected when a student comes to you who is non-binary and is having their Bar Mitzvah?
I want to just tell a story about how powerful this work is and communities to get ahead of this and not do this when an individual comes up right through the ranks. We at SAJ had a whole process by which we moved towards moving from bat mitzvah language to Bar Mitzvah language. That was already all in place. And one day I get a call from a panicked mother 2 months before this kid's ceremony saying, okay, my kid just told me that they're non-binary, but everything says bat mitzvah, our invitations are everything. And what do we do? And I was like, okay, do what you need to do for your invitations, but we've got you. It's already done. 2 months later, pronouns honored, and nothing had changed for this child. It was already in place. There are so many kids that are figuring it out, and it's so critically important. I also have a friend who's talked about having a bat mitzvah as a very painful experience, just like so many other childhood experiences where they had gender dysphoria. It's not a small thing. This is really a huge, huge difference in people's lives when we pay attention and make space for people of all genders to have this ceremony.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We wanted to close out this conversation by reminding you we've got a bunch more episodes in this unit on Bar Mitzvah. It's past, it's present, it's future. We hope that you will continue honoring your way through this unit with us as we think together about this important life cycle event. Also, a reminder, we've got some amazing mini courses coming up in the Anya Shiva. There are some that started a little while ago, but there's others that haven't started yet. They start in early May. Make sure that you sign up at judaismunbound.com/classes. We've got some amazing options for you. Check them out there. And of course, we hope that you'll be in touch with us. You can hit us up via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our handles are at JudaismUnbound. You can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last thing that we'll say to close this episode is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.